All right, Governor, first of all, thank you very much for sitting down with us. I know you've had a busy day today. You're on your way out of town to Washington, D.C., the coldest place on earth, in the United States at least, today.
Yeah, I think so. I think so.
Let's talk a little bit about what you kind of defined as a three-prong problem in the state of Arkansas in terms of what you want to address in terms of prison reform, public safety reform. Give me the three prongs.
Well, we do have a problem, but it all leads to two aspects of it. One, we need more prison space, and secondly, we want to break that cycle of whenever they're released from prison, the recidivism rate, they're going back to prison, and so we want to break that cycle. The best way to do it is three-part prong approach, which is more prison space, but then secondly, a more effective reentry programs and more parole officers to provide accountability. And thirdly, we need to invest some money in alternative sentencing courts for nonviolent offenders. That's to me, you have to have all parts of that to make a system work and to function and to change behavior. And so that's all three parts of what we're trying to do in this plan.
I want to do two math equations with you. Let's start first with the prison population right now. We got about 18,000 in prisons right now, which is way over the maximum capacity for our state prisons to handle. With some of the reforms that you outlined on Wednesday, you're talking about 200 prisoners here, 288 prisoners here, maybe 500 prisoners here. You're still going to be way over the maximum amount for population. So how do you bring that down more rapidly?
Well, you bring it down more rapidly by opening up an additional space, and then secondly, you're going to hopefully change behavior. Now, that's a hope. We've never tried this before in terms of a real investment and more accountability on the final end of their sentence when they're returning into society. And so this is something that makes sense. I think it's our best chance to change behavior. But in the end, you're right, the numbers are challenging for us because we want to not only reduce the prison population in prison, but we also want to reduce the backlog in our county jails. And so they're probably 1,000 more than they should be. So it's a combination, though, and this approach, though, is trying to provide the greatest flexibility. For example, we're trying something with our counties. That's a lower cost solution, and we're putting it out to our counties that if you want to build a regional jail facility, contract with the state, then that's going to provide us more flexibility in our prison population. You're providing some counties with the opportunity to have additional state prisoners there, but we have a better funding flow for them. So there's a lot of options here that gives us more flexibility to manage the prison population.
So the other math equation that I want to work through, and it's the budget side of this, is that you've identified a $64 million question, to kind of borrow the phrase from the old quiz show there. $32 million in this next biennium is what you want to spend to try to address some of these reforms that you're talking about here. Does that money just grow on trees? I've had a lot of people ask me, you know, the $32 million, it was sitting in reserves over at the insurance department, or a big chunk of it was $31 million. Why was that money building up? Where are there other pockets of money like that?
It's a good question. I've asked the same question to our finance officials who are doing a great job. But this is part of our budget system where you've got funding balances in different agencies. We've looked at those very closely, and I'm satisfied there's not a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. Mm-hmm. But this is a changing of the process so that we can draw on that reserve this year versus a smaller amount next year. So I think it's a prudent decision, but it solves a statewide problem. And it does it in a rather conservative way. If you'll notice that what we didn't tap would be projected revenues down the road and projected surpluses. We did not tap into that, which gives us some cushion down the road. This is money that we have right now that we can add to our balanced budget. And also,
it'll just require some special language to move it from where it's at to where you want to put it, correct?
Right. There's some legislative language that will be necessary, but it's been done in the past, so it's not that unusual of a step that we're taking, but it is very important for this problem.
So where does the other $32 million come from in the next biennium? Is this going to be part of growth revenue? You'll have to build this into the budget, or are you hoping that it won't be a $32 million problem remaining because of some of the reforms 2 years from now?
Well, you know, we'll take it a step at a time. We're investing $32 million now initially for this three-pronged approach, and then that will be absorbed over the course of the next 2 years and built into the budget. I mentioned it's another $32 million plan that we have, which can be by growth revenues, it can be by also, it's a cushion there for more flexibility. If we find that we're going to be utilizing more county jail space, then that gives us less need to construct more prison beds. If we're going to, that's not going to work out with the county jails, then we're going to have to construct more prison beds. So some flexibility and give and take in that system. So we're planning for a $64 million solution, and I just remind ourselves that this sure beats a $100 million solution, which is a 1,000-bed new prison, which had been advocated.
You'll get the criticism, though. You know it's out there. You know it's going to come in the days to come, that we did a $100 million tax cut. So you could have paid for the $64 million problem out of the tax cuts, but you would have had to renege a little bit on your campaign promise in that respect. At the same time, is public safety not a higher priority than tax cuts?
You got to balance all of those. The most important thing is that we grow our economy, create more jobs, and when you have a growing economy, you're going to have funds for public safety, for paying teachers, for building highways. That's been the plan all along, and so you'd be very short-sighted in my judgment if we set aside a tax cut that grows our economy in order to put it in short-term spending for some of these solutions. You've got to balance those out. I think we've done that in our budget.
Let's talk about how you change this behavior that you're talking about, because this is really what the whole model's predicated upon, is that you will change them. You've got to find a way to address drug addictions with some of these parolees and people that are out on probation. You've got to find a way to address mental health issues. You've got to find a way to put enough of an incentive out there that they don't want to go back to prison because there is a better hope or opportunity, whether it's education or a job out there. How does that whole model work outside of what we were already doing in that respect?
Well, for example, right now, a parolee will come out of prison after being in there 6, 10 years. They're given $100 and a bus ticket and say, you're on your way. Well, that makes it pretty small odds that they're going to succeed in the free world when they don't have the job training they need. They might not have the social skills after being in prison for that time. And so for the first time in the history of Arkansas, we're putting in 500 reentry beds. Probably not as many as you need, but it's an investment that we hope will pay off, that those parolees can go into a 6-month reentry program that will include job training skills, that will include counseling as needed, mental health issues if needed, but hopefully primarily to build the job skills so that they can identify employment. If there's family issues involved, it helps to have that time to transition back. That gives them the best chance of not going back to prison, but actually succeeding as a parolee coming out. And again, I want to emphasize the importance of enlisting the faith-based community as well. You know, our limited resources as a state can be magnified by the use of nonprofits and by their engagement in helping these parolees coming out, getting themselves back into the community and into a job.
So give me a little bit more description of the model, though. So say I'm in one of these 500-bed transition prisons here. I'm coming back out into the real world. Who is leading me on this skills search, on this education training? I mean, it's not somebody that already exists in the prison system, is it?
No, and this proposal includes staffing for those reentry centers. We have additional parole officers that are being assigned that brings accountability for those that are on parole, brings drug treatment counselors into play. Again, never enough, but additional resources in all of those areas so that it's not just a matter of making sure the parolee hopefully has the job skills needed, but also that they're drug-free, that they're accountable, that if there's a violation, they're held accountable for that. And so it's accountability and the surety of a consequence for misbehavior that changes behavior. And so that's part of the reentry part of the program. And so, you know, we're going to leave some of the details. Sheila Sharp at Department of Community Corrections is very excited about, for the first time, having some resources to help these that are coming back into society actually get a job and be constructive again.
So this incentive that you're talking about to not go back into the system, you've got obviously parolees that know how to game the system. So what additional tools do you give law enforcement that will allow them to say, you really, that's an alternative you don't want to consider?
Well, there will be some legislation that has been introduced that's going to address some of these issues. That gives more tools to law enforcement.
Give me an example of one.
Well, you know, I know that one thing that might be a little bit controversial, but it actually gives law enforcement the authority to conduct a search of a parolee without having to get a warrant. And so it'd be based upon a consent that you're going to enter this system, but you're giving up some of your Fourth Amendment rights in order to make sure that you're able to participate in this program. And so that's something we've got to work through the legislative process, but that's an example of a tool
What makes
that's
you think
out there.
that would be controversial? Giving up one of your constitutional rights. But don't they do that to some extent already in the parole process, don't they?
Sure, that's not unusual in that way, but we want to make it work. And law enforcement has a big role to play, so that, you know, if they're stopping a parolee that might be going to work and they feel like they need to do a search of the vehicle, they have the authority to do that. You know, in addition, I don't want to focus just on the reentry side of it. Let's look at the front end of the equation as well in terms of changing behavior and addressing the prison population. We want to have a focus on alternative sentencing for nonviolent offenders. And so this initiative has grant money for the 28 judicial districts at $100,000 per district. That totals $2.8 million, so that they can utilize the opportunity for alternative sentencing with accountability for nonviolent offenders. Hopefully that will help change behavior, help reduce drug addiction, help our veterans that might be struggling with stress and crime problems at the same time.
So, and those are highly supervised kind of programs that people go through, where there's a lot of touch points to keep them on track.
That's right. It takes a lot of resources, a very committed judge to do it. You've got to have parole officers that are engaged in it. The prosecutors are an important part of the equation. And if they mess up, if they don't pass the drug test, there are consequences to it, and that consequences with accountability hopefully will lead to change behavior and reduce the prison population at the same time.
You also want to make some parole board changes, some reforms to how the parole board process works, the construction of what the chairman's duties are, what kind of constitutes mandatory release, somebody that might not be doing their job. Give me some examples of what you hope happens with parole board reforms.
Well, we've got a very strong parole board that has a lot of authority, and you know, there's a requirement in the law that they're full-time. We want to be able to give the chairman additional supervisory responsibility to make sure that the parole board is functioning well, and so that's part of the equation, so that we have some leadership and direction and authority within the chairman of the parole board to make sure, just like the PSC or some other commission, is working properly, and that they have the authority to run that agency. So that's a part of it. Also, I think you'll see some offenses that are mandatory releases now that they're given more discretion for, more transparency in what's before the parole board with the legislature, and so all of that will bring more scrutiny, more responsibility, and because you don't want to make a mistake. Now, they have enormous challenges that they face, but hopefully this will give them more tools and more discretion to make sure we keep the dangerous ones off the street and that they're able to say no. For example, in the reentry, part of the reentry is that within 6 months of a parole eligibility date, if the parole board approves it, they can go into a reentry circumstance. situation. But that takes a decision of the Parole Board, and we want to make sure they're managed properly and that they're doing their duty and their due diligence on each of these applications.
I don't want to say that you've had an easy time with the legislature so far, but the private option debate and the tax cut debate went about as smooth as they possibly could. Do you anticipate this being a smooth debate, or do you think that there will be a whole lot of give and take and a lot of discussion about some of these things in this omnibus bill, at least?
Without any question, there's going to be a lot of discussion and debate on it, and we welcome that. We have tried to lay a good foundation. I've met with both Democrat, Republican legislators as this is being formed, and they've done much of this work. When I talk about the legislative part of this, this is much of the hard work they've put in over the last couple of years. And so it's complementary to it, but I expect a very vigorous debate, and you're also talking about money. And whenever you're talking about money, that's always part of it. The prosecutors, you know, are somewhat skeptical, and we want their close eyes on this as well, because their voice needs to be heard and they need to help shape this.
Why are they skeptical? They just don't think it'll work?
Well, you'll have to talk to them, but their main message is we need more bed space. And we need to make sure that our criminal justice system works, and that's a big part of the equation. That's been provided there. We want to make sure they're happy with that. They also, you know, I'm sure they'll be looking with some scrutiny on the parole side of it, but I think when they look at it, you'll see when you have more parole officers assigned, we have a better chance of accountability, and I think accountability is exactly what they want.